Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Lori London. I'm a marketing manager here at Hyperproof, and I will be getting us started today. Today, our topic is using our SOC2 readiness journey to improve your security posture. The content today will be presented by Charlie Wood, Executive Vice President and Partner at the Bonadio Group, and Marco Saccardo, the Director of Solutions Architecture at Hyperproof. Our speakers will cover the recent trends on SOC 2, including new guidance from the AICPA, how to create a security program that can satisfy multiple compliance frameworks, including SOC 2, PCI DSS, HIPAA, and many others, which security controls every organization needs to address these frameworks, why compliance does not always equal security, and how technology can help you to maintain both. A bit of housekeeping points before we get started. If you do have any questions throughout the presentation, we welcome you to enter them into the Q&A box for our presenters to answer after they've presented their information. If you are having any problems with audio or visual during the event, please try leaving the presentation and re-entering. If this doesn't work, please let us know you're having some trouble in the Q&A box, and we'll try to help you as best we can. The event is being recorded and will be available on demand on our Bright Talk channel following the closing, and attendees will receive an email with a link to the on-demand event. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our presenters, Charlie and Marco. It's up to you now.
Thanks, and good afternoon, everybody on the East Coast, and to my friends on the West Coast, good morning. I'm Charlie Wood. The intro was communicated. I'm a partner with the Bonadio Group. I've been here almost 13 years. I've been in industry for almost 25. I run our SOC 2 and SOC 1 practice, as well as PCI and another handful of other areas within the Bonadio Group. So I appreciate everybody taking the time today to meet with us. Marco, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Marco Saccardo. I lead solutions architecture here at Hyperproof. I work closely with a lot of our clients that are starting their SOC 2 journey, and I actually work closely with Charlie for over a year now, helping companies begin that process of getting compliant. And so I'm really looking forward to sharing some tips and tricks and some information that Charlie and I have learned along the way.
Thanks, Marco. So here is the agenda for today. We're going to talk about starting and creating a security program that's built off of SOC 2. We're going to talk about some key controls, using compliance software to maintain compliance, and some of the recent trends, the AICPA. So one of the things that we've been seeing over the past 16 to 18 months is that people are trying to go in and get through the SOC process in just a very quick process and manner, and they're not looking at the SOC process for what it is. The SOC framework is a prescriptive set of controls that have been detailed and outlined by the AICPA, but at the end of the day, they're best business practice and best security practices. So, as you try to stand up these controls and you continue down this journey, don't cut corners. One of the biggest things that we've seen are people trying to stand up compliance initiatives like a SOC 2 in days or weeks instead of looking at it for what it is, and that is an opportunity for your organization to build out long-term sustainable security controls and protocols that'll keep your organization relatively secure. So we'll talk about that a little bit in more detail as we go through this, but keep that in mind. So where should you start your security program when you're addressing compliance? There's some key things in here, and there are things that we see some of our customers struggle with. So it's knowing your industry and your customers. That one's pretty simple and straightforward, right? Your customers want to see this report. They're probably asking you for it if you're here and you're listening to the presentation today. But understanding and knowing your tech stack is something that is surprisingly unknown to a lot of organizations as we go in year one to try to help them become SOC 2 compliant. They don't understand the technology they have, and it's very difficult to obviously protect something that you don't understand. So you're going to want to know your tech stack. You're going to want to work with people that may be outside of your operational area to understand that. And you're going to want to do that in particular when you start building out your risk assessment, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. The other thing we always see is know what data you collect and where it goes. we're also a PCI QSA organization. One of the biggest concerns we see is people don't know where the data travels once it comes in-house. So a lot of times we'll go in and we'll run sensitive data scans and we'll find data in spots that it never should have been. And again, it's very hard to protect what you don't know it exists. So getting these sort of foundational things in place before you start down your path is obviously critical. And then know the risks that your organization is facing. Not every organization faces the same risk. If you're a manufacturing company, you face a different risk than an organization like a bank or a financial institution, because those organizations have sensitive data that a manufacturing organization may not. So tailoring your risk assessment and your controls to your industry is very, very important. So what's typically required of any framework? There's the exciting space of policies. We're going to talk about on the next slide the specific policies, but policies are big. They're required for virtually every law, regulation, and standard you can think of. And you've got to have them, and they've got to be detailed enough that a reasonable person can come in and understand what you do. So it takes a fair amount of time for most organizations to build those policies. So again, getting back to my earlier statement about people trying to turn this thing around in 30 to 60 days, just writing those policies and getting them detailed enough that an organization can understand what they're doing and an external auditor is not an easy lift. In addition to that, a risk assessment. You should create an organization-wide risk assessment. Understand your organizational risks and rank them, based on people, processes, and technology that you have in place. So risk assessments are very critical. You're going to see when we get into the control slide, generally risk assessments are done on an annual basis. But again, you got to know what you have there in order to appropriately alleviate your risk and build controls that'll mitigate those risks. Other things you need to build. You need to build out your controls. You need to tailor them. We're going to talk in a little bit about the prescriptive controls associated with the SOC2, but you need to tailor them for your organization. I can't tell you how many times we've gone into places and they use illustrative controls that they can't actually adhere to. And then we get in there to do our audit. The audit period has begun, and we start testing against the controls, against the policies, and they're just not in place. And so there's failures, and that doesn't look good for anyone. So, and then you've got to collect evidence of your controls that you're testing. So when you have an auditor come in, they're going to want to see the evidence, so you got to maintain those things. So those are the basics for every control framework. So I mentioned policies before. They take a lot of time to create. So you've got to develop these policies. You've got to create the key controls, and bake them into these policies. So here's just a small group of ones that you would need to create in order to pass a SOC2, in order to pass HIPAA, PCI, and some of the other ones. I'm not going to read them, but I can confidently tell you that the information security policy is probably the most critical, because it talks about all the ways you secure your customer data or your network from external resources. If you need policies, the other thing I would highly recommend, if you're going down the path of having a SOC2 and you've already engaged an accounting firm, the accounting firm cannot write your policies for you because that would impair independence, but they may have template policies that you may be able to leverage. They may also have template controls and illustrative controls that you may be able to leverage. Again, they can't write them for you, but they can help you get a template or foundation in place that you can start building those controls and tailoring them to your organization, your organizational needs. So I've been talking about controls. So what are controls? Controls are ways, it's on the next slide, they describe the activities, the processes, the policies, the technology used to satisfy requirements or mitigate risk, right? So a control may be, hey, we restrict network access to our organization. But the real control is we restrict access to the external network. But once you've tailored the control, it'll be something to the effect of, we do that by the following. We have firewalls in place and you need VPN access. So there's a lot of ways to get there, but you've got to build these controls. And some of your controls, as you see on this slide, some will be detective, some will be preventative, and some will be corrective. So a detective control might be, hey, somebody logged on at 3 a.m. or attempted to log on using a domain admin access or user account. That's a detective control, and that's a pretty big one because most IT folks don't log on in the middle of the night. Well, you're probably going to want to know about that pretty quickly. So you may have that control in place, again, depending on what you do and what your sort of secret sauce is your business is. Preventative controls could be things like, powerful passwords are in place to prevent access to your application. So there's a lot of ways to get there. You'll hear these things over and over, and as you're building out your plan, you'll hear these, and they're things to keep in mind because you want to have these discussions with whatever auditor that you bring in. Getting back to the previous slide where it goes into what are controls, here's an example, I hope everybody can see it, of a control and what it's basically made of. There's a base control or a control statement that says, hey, this is what we do. And then it gets into, the controls specific wording. This is exactly what we do, and this is how we address the controls and basically secure our infrastructure following these guidelines. So you'll hear me keep saying the controls. This is a NIST SP 800 control. It's pretty standard, but it talks about storage of audit records. So I won't get into too much, but audit records need to be kept because when your auditors come in and want to look at what you've done, you got to make sure you have enough space and bandwidth to keep those. Also, if you're reviewing logs on a monthly basis, you want to make sure you have enough log capacity and log space that you can actually keep all that information and do any sort of correlation and review of those logs. So this is just an example of a control. We're going to get into this in a little bit more detail in a couple more sections. So one of the most critical things that you're going to do as an organization is select controls for your organization. These are the things that the auditors will come in and look at, but they're also an opportunity to build strong security protocols. So what we always recommend is you start with some illustrative controls. We've talked heavily so far about SOC2. SOC 2 has prescriptive controls over 5 trust criteria. There's security, it's now called common criteria. There's process integrity, availability, confidentiality, and privacy. These all give best security practices for building controls to help limit your organizational risk. So when you're starting to build your controls, start with a trusted framework. There's a couple on here that you can start with. If you're going down the SOC 2 journey, I would start with the prescriptive controls as outlined by the AICPA. And then create your controls. Again, the auditors aren't allowed to, design your control. But if you've already got somebody that you're using, or you've got somebody that you've used in the past, reach out to them and ask them if the controls seem reasonable for your organization and your type. If you've already engaged somebody to come in 6 months to do your audit, I'm sure would love to know the controls you have in place, and they're probably going to comment relative to whether or not they think they're designed appropriately. So talk to whoever you have coming in, an accounting firm, or reach out to somebody, a trusted partner that maybe has been through this before, and ask. Right? Everybody wants to see that you guys get these things right, whether it's your auditor, whether it's a friend or a colleague. So reach out and ask questions. Other than that, use the control frameworks that we outlined here. So selecting your controls for your organization, designing the control, we've talked about that before. Right? So once you've designed the control, you've then got to assign responsibility and ownership for this. So now we have no one in any of our organizations is responsible for every control. You generally design the control based on knowledge of the control and whether or not that person can effectively ratify whether the control works appropriately. So, like for example, if you've got a domain admin, that has access to audit logs, we want to make sure that domain admin can't access those audit logs, but the domain admin may have the most experience and knowledge to be able to look at and say whether or not they were concerned about the scenario I posed earlier about somebody trying to log on at 3:30 in the morning from, using a powerful user account. So you want to design these things that there's segregation of duties in place. but also assign them that they're appropriate enough that the right person is looking at the control to make sure that it operates effectively. I mentioned earlier about how people over the last 16 to 18 months are trying to stand these controls up within a small period of time. Like, that is very, very difficult. And here's another reason. You've got to train the people internally to test the controls and verify the controls operate effectively. This isn't an exercise of just, hey, I'm going to write a control and I'm just going to say it's in place and I've got a policy and hope we collect the evidence. There's a lot more to it. You've got to have control owners. You've got to evidence the things. And then you've got to design these things so that they operate on a regular cadence that can be proven by your organization, either to an auditor or someone else. So these are the next steps in the process. The frequency of the control may change. There's some examples here in the step 3 about, the sort of the frequency of things that may operate in the annual or weekly or monthly space. So I've said a lot. Marco, is there anything that you'd like to add, or is there anything I missed?
No, I don't think there's anything you missed, but just something to add. It's really apparent hearing Charlie talk about this, that he's had a life all around this kind of work. And there's a level of complexity that comes out to the surface that can be intimidating. And it's why organizations like Bonadio Group or Hyperproof work together to tackle different areas of that lift. One that we'll talk about a little bit later is making sense of all of this from an organizational standpoint. But the knowledge is certainly a piece that isn't really expected of a small organization to have all of the answers or to get a quick outcome. The best way is to really learn and take the time with people who have that experience, but also leverage tools that help you maintain a posture of compliance. And so I think that's really apparent from what you said, Charlie. It was really interesting.
Good. All right, we're on the next section, key controls for securing SOC 2 and other compliance. And again, these are, you can read the disclaimer here. These are best control practices. And by the way, you can design these things any way you want, just as long as they meet the spirit of the control objectives. So you're going to see some examples on here that might not fit your organization. And that gets to my earlier point relative to why you need to specifically design these for your own organization and why you should reach out to your auditor or someone similar to make sure they seem reasonably designed. So that being said, here's some continuous control examples. These are things that happen on a pretty regular basis, things that you can do that operate on a daily basis, right? So your antivirus, the last one on here. If you install antivirus, it should be configured to receive daily updates. It's going to limit your amount of risk that you get some virus that's going to shut your entire organization down. You should have intrusion detection in place. You probably have, if you do have in place, you know there's tens of thousands of events that come across on a daily basis, and it's sifting through that to see what the big things are, or aggregating or correlating those things that are of importance. The daily backups, one of the most important controls that we've seen in the last several years, is ransomware becomes more prevalent. Bad guys go into your network and they try to encrypt your information. The best way to get that back traditionally has been having strong or solid backups so you can restore that data without paying the ransom. So just a couple examples of some continuous controls. Some weekly controls that we see in the SOC 2 space, as well as PCI and HIPAA and some others. IT meeting on a weekly basis to go over, hey, this is what we see on the network. Here's some of the issues we had. Here's some of the changes that are coming. Those weekly controls should be documented because almost every one of our SOC 2 clients actually has a similar control to this. So how do you do this? How do you evidence it? So if you have a weekly standard meeting and you have an agenda and there's some notes being taken, you take the notes, what you covered, and you keep those filed away in a folder or put them in a tool such as Hyperproof so that when the audit starts, the auditor can get to it quickly. But a pretty quick and simple example of a weekly control. Some of the monthly controls here, and again, these are just examples. They may not be weekly or monthly controls. They may be weekly or they may be semi-annual controls. But some of the big ones here, basically change management. So depending on how often you change your organization, you may have monthly meetings whereby your IT and operations folks get together, talk about the changes that were made last month. They talk about upcoming changes, make sure they got the users ready to do the user acceptance testing and that the changes aren't going to impact the organization. So that's a pretty straightforward one. Other examples, some organizations run vulnerability scans on a monthly basis. PCI requires that to be run on a quarterly basis, but some people like to go above and beyond that because what was secure this morning may not be secure now, and malicious threat actors might be trying to exploit those vulnerabilities. So some organizations say, for my company and our risk assessment, we want to do monthly vulnerabilities, even though quarterly or semi-annual are done by most others. So again, you can read through this. I'm not going to go through all these. This is recorded, so if you want to listen to it again, you can certainly pause. But just a couple examples of some monthly controls. So again, some quarterly, semi-annual. It could be the vulnerability scans. There's user access reviews are generally done every 6 months. Reviews the data, the centers are done usually every 6 months. So again, a couple of examples here. But again, I'm not going to read through all of them. And then finally, there's some annual controls on here too. I talked earlier, the risk assessment. Most organizations perform an annual risk assessment. And that is, know the stack, know the risks of your organization, given the ever-changing landscape of cybersecurity and security in general. They do annual risk assessments, and that's what they build their security protocols off of. So that's in here, pen testing, so hacking, penetration testing. Most laws and regs, including PCI, require at least annual penetration testing of your organization. For those of you that don't know, that's essentially simulating a bad guy trying to get into your organization and exfiltrate data out of it. It may be an external, which is simulate somebody that's not inside your organizational walls. Bad guy sitting in Russia or someplace else. They also, on an annual basis, most laws want you to try, and regs want you to try to do an internal pen test. That simulates a bad guy's already inside, whether that's an employee who's disgruntled or an employee clicked on a malicious link, which allowed the bad guys to get their ID and password, and so they're in. So penetration testing is imperative. It's required, again, by virtually every law, regulation, standard. But as I said before, take a look at the list here, and these are things that you should probably have in place, but I'm not going to go through each one individually. All right. So Marco, I've been monopolizing the time. Anything you wanted to add to that? Anything you see on the hyperproof side as people are building controls?
No, that makes sense. I mean, really the idea behind going through each of those critical control types is knowing that they're not all the same. They're pretty nuanced. And Charlie has mentioned this point, but you do have to make the controls your own, similarly to the activity of tailoring your policies. What you're doing is reflecting your own business so that your compliance work is actually legitimate. And so that's a big part of the work that Charlie and I do, is giving people the ability to make those specifications. And that's why identifying those controls in that manner is important.
Thanks, Marco. So the next section talks about SOC 2 exam. What do you got to do to get ready for it? So it's pretty straightforward. We've talked at length about it, right? So we've been here for 25 minutes. We've been talking about building the control framework. So leverage an industry accepted one if you'd like. SOC 2 is again has a pretty good prescriptive group of controls. Tailor those controls, to your organization and look at them from a feasibility perspective. And what I mean by that is, don't try to implement controls that you can't possibly put in place or you can't evidence. Year one for a lot of our organizations, they'll try to build controls if they don't reach out to us, that they're just too time consuming, too expensive, and go so far above and beyond that it's actually cost prohibitive for them to put the controls in place. They don't realize it though. And therein lies the problem. They don't realize it until, we start talking to them and start getting in there to go, okay, well, we need to see the following evidence. So that's why I said before, reach out to your auditing firm and really work with them before you get too far down the rabbit hole of standing up controls, because you may end up spending a bunch of money you don't need to be spending. So the other area in common here is to make sure the controls are auditable. I'll give you a sort of an archaic example of something we see that's really tough to audit. If we go to an organization and they say, hey, we limit access to our data center based on keys, and I check every day to make sure the door is locked, that's really hard to audit because there's not a lot of technology behind it. What you could do in that case is get a list of who has access, who has keys. You could talk to those folks. You could also put a sign-in sheet inside the data center for anybody that comes in. But at the end of the day, make sure when you're building controls that they're auditable. So again, reach out to your auditing firm to make sure it seems reasonable. I know I keep saying that, but I really hate for people to waste time. Then the next item, you got to assign control owners. You know, you're going to be assigning these to people who understand what the control is and provide reasonable knowledge that the control is evidenced and operating effectively. So build the controls, alert the control owners. Another question we always get is, well, if I got a control owner that's not doing the job, how do I get them to do it? A lot of times organizations will have performance reviews. You make it part of their performance review that whatever controls they're overseeing, that they're ensuring that those controls are operating effectively and they're evidencing that. And then build your policies and procedures around the controls. Marco, anything I missed on that, or anything you want to?
No, that was pretty comprehensive.
Okay. And then what should you do next? Have a gap assessment. Right. So the AICPA rules preclude accounting firms from telling you how to design the controls, as I said a couple times already. But they can perform gap assessments with you to let you understand what they traditionally see at other customers of similar size and complexity. While they can't tell you exactly how to put the controls in place, they can tell you what other organizations of similar size and complexity have put in place. And they can answer your questions relative to what are you going to look for when you come in here, so that, again, building this thing right. So having a gap assessment done, you can do that internally once you've built the control framework, once you've got that blessed by whoever you're going to have blessed, whether it's your auditor, whoever, you can do that gap assessment and always err on the side of caution. We do a lot of things outside of SOC2. We do a lot of consulting in the PCI space. So we're allowed to recommend and actually help them implement controls. Right? So if you're not going down the SOC2 space and you're not using your auditor for this, you're using external third party that's equally as qualified. Have them go in here and do a deep dive. And where you think you have it in place, because what we always hear is, I think it's there. Nope, show me it. Let me see that you have it. Rather than, just go, I think I'm 90% of the way there. Have your external party look at it and do a deep dive into it. Have them collect evidence. Have them talk to the people that are responsible for the control. Have them review the policies. Do a deep dive into that, because the last thing you want once the audit period starts is to have all these gaps. Because those gaps are going to lead to exceptions in the report, and we'll get to it in a few minutes. Those exceptions lead to issues that can lead your auditor to modify their opinion, to tell, essentially say you're not compliant with this. And the last thing you want to do is issue an expensive report that says these controls don't operate effectively, they're not designed right, and you can't prove to me that they're in place. So have the gap assessment done up front. It's a very, very, very critical step in the entire process. And then the last item here, remediate gaps prior to your audit. Common sense, right? Make sure the stuff's in place. Make sure you do that pre-assessment. I would do it within a month prior to the start of your audit period if this is year one. If it's not year one, you'll see in a couple slides. If you're doing a SOC, you did a SOC last year and this is year two, one of the other things we always hear is like, I'll worry about it during when the auditors come in. You can't do that. Because by the time the auditors come in, you may have 6-9 months of failed controls in a 12-month period, and you're in a world of hurt because you're going to get a report with a modified opinion, which is nerd speak for auditors saying you've got a lot of problems and your controls don't operate effectively. We'll get into that in a second. Oh, and here's the slide. So Here's what to expect when you have an audit. You're going to have findings, right? It is very rare. We do over 100 SOC jobs a year. It is rare that you don't have any exceptions. But where the problems lie, when you have multiple exceptions and you're trying to say, hey, I've got a secure network, and then those exceptions are in those sort of security controls, which would lead a reasonable person who's reading this report to go, I don't think that you're that secure. So you'll hear things from your auditors like major, minor, qualified opinion, unqualified, exception, critical, the basics, right? When you're in a spot and you're doing a SOC 2 and you hear a qualified opinion, that means that your controls don't operate effectively. And I can tell you as a guy who reads hundreds of these, because we're auditors and we read other SOC 2s provided by other organizations, when we see qualified opinion, that means that organization isn't very secure. And it means that we've probably got to do some additional procedures. We may have to reach out to that organization and do our own testing. Because the goal really with the SOC 2 is twofold. It's one, stand up the controls so that you're reasonably secure, but it's also to keep other auditors from knocking on the door going, I gotta audit you for the same thing. So when you give a qualified opinion because your controls don't operate effectively, that's a bad spot to be in. And the last item on here, once your audit's over, the next one's already started. So we're going to talk in another slide about continuing the process, but essentially it is just because the auditors left and the period ended, you got to make sure those controls are in place and you got to make sure they operate effectively and you continue to maintain and collect the evidence. Anything on that, Marco, that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I just think that's a really important point to let sink in. What is the point of all of this if not to show that you're truly secure, truly valuing the privacy of your information and your data? And so that concept, that last bullet of your audit starts the moment your last one finished, it's really representative of continuous compliance and what that means. It means that businesses do work with you and they partner with you on a basis of these certifications, and pursuing them as a point in time blip like the audit is not really doing it justice. And so we think about the thoughtfulness behind our procedure. That's why we want to have systems and a knowledge base in place that we can be continually compliant, but just I think a really critical point to let sink in. But that's it. Thanks, Charlie.
Yep. Thanks, Mara. So how do you make sure that things continue down the path of being in place and operating effectively? Perform self-assessments internally. Once you've stood this up year one, you understand the controls, your people understand the controls, the sort of education phase is over with. Perform regular audits internally. And it doesn't have to be to the level of an external auditor coming in, but a reasonableness check on each of the controls on a quarterly basis is something that, I'd highly recommend. Because again, you don't want to wait till your auditors come back 9 months later to go, oh, gee, that control hasn't operated since you guys left. Because again, that's problematic. So perform regular self-assessments. When you do your risk assessment on an annual basis, feel free to add, modify, or remove controls based on what the present day risk is. But work with your external auditor, if you've got one, to make sure that it's not going to materially change their opinion on, your control environment. So again, ask, right? But continuously look to improve and think about ways to modify the controls to provide the most value to your organization. The most value being securing the sensitive information that you have and keeping you guys out of the newspaper with an associated breach. And then collect the evidence on an ongoing basis. So Marco's going to talk about hyperproof in a minute in a little bit more detail, but collect the data, take a look at it, and make sure it seems reasonable and put it in a spot that is both secure because some of it's sensitive, but also in a spot that your auditors will be able to get to when they come on site or want to remotely access the information during the audit period. And again, stay on top of the risks. We talked about the tech stack a couple times. Understand where the data is being stored, what types of data you have, the vendors. That's another big area that we haven't talked about. Vendor management has become a critical control for our customers over the last couple of years. You look at some of the big PCI breaches. Target, for example. Target lost tens of millions of credit cards. And they lost it because of Fazio Mechanical. which is, if nobody knows who Fazio Mechanical is, it was a small organization that had access to their network. They do some heating and cooling for the organization and a couple of their stores. Well, I think in 2014 or so, they got a phishing email. Somebody clicked on it, and the bad guys exfiltrated an ID and password, and that's all they needed. They connected to the target network. They got in. They escalated their privileges, and they started siphoning off millions of credit cards. So, vendors, anyone that can connect to your network, access your information, make sure you're doing the proper due diligence and vetting them before allowing them to access your environment. And another thing you can always ask for, if this is new to you, ask your vendors, your third-party service providers, for their SOC2 report, because most of them should be doing that to demonstrate that they have the appropriate protocols in place to limit the risk of loss of their data as well as yours because they connect with it. All right, Marco, I'm going to turn it over to you. Can you actually drive, or do I got to drive?
I can drive.
Nice.
All right. So thanks, Charlie. That was super comprehensive and shed a lot of light into the amount of work it takes to stand up a SOC 2 program, both in terms of documentation, in terms of knowledge, but in terms of assessing and actually following through with it as one should. So I am here representing HyperProof, and HyperProof is a compliance operations software that many CPA firms use for auditing purposes, that many companies use to manage their own compliance posture. You can see some of the companies we work with down here below, and maybe you'll think, I'm just starting my SOC 2 journey. Those companies are huge. That'd be fair. What's interesting about HyperProof is that it scales with companies from being a very small business to a very large business. So we work with a lot of 1 to 2 person startups that are just starting out, and we help them in the basics of managing their compliance posture through our model. So our model is about maintaining well-written, universal controls that can be reutilized down the road when you branch out beyond a SOC 2. But to start out, we want to create a platform that allows you to collaborate on them, to conduct tests on them, to even submit them to an audit very easily with all of the respective evidence that you've put together in support of them, with all of the respective policies. The idea fundamentally behind the compliance operations model is a system that builds upon itself. We conducted over 180 interviews with compliance managers of all levels of companies across maturity. And what we learned from them was that there really wasn't any technology supporting the actual work that they were doing. There was technology that helped them in bits and pieces, but it didn't even emulate the workflow of work that they have to do, the workflows that Charlie talked about earlier. And so what we thought is, let's go build it. And that's exactly what we did. And we have hundreds of success stories with companies that are using HyperProof's technology to not only manage their compliance, but observe it and share that information. Charlie touched on a really interesting point about assessing your risks, both in relation to the business, but also your vendors. With HyperProof, we can connect that information because your risks represent the liabilities of the business across products and projects and teams. But your compliance posture represents how you mitigate that risk actively. So those two things should be connected together. And that's what platforms like HyperProof are intended to do. And we do very well because we don't just connect that information, but we also give you real-time health metrics on how those controls impact your risks and vice versa. So a few critical success factors to our model. The first is that we need it to be intuitive and easy to use. So we have a big emphasis on user interface in our platform to make it easy to understand, because you have to make sense of the complexities that Charlie talked about earlier. On top of that, we need to integrate into the tech stack that you utilize. Charlie touched on evidence collection. That's a huge lift, and it happens multiple times in a single year. You collect evidence and allocate it to controls to show how those controls are being represented. But on top of that, when the audit comes around, you have to redistribute that evidence again. So it happens twice. So with HyperProof, we automate evidence collection in many ways, and we also automate the routing of that evidence to your audit portal so that it's there when you need it. Collaboration is a huge part of what we do, and so we don't just allow you to delegate work to the folks that are responsible for specific controls, but also communicate them with class-leading communication tools like Slack and Microsoft Teams or Zoom directly embedded in the platform. I did touch earlier on scalability, but we are one of the few technologies out there that works across all segments. Without expensive versions or big changes that need to happen, you can truly scale the way Hyperproof is designed and add new frameworks as you continue to grow and venture into new verticals or new markets. So I touched a little bit on automation, but one thing that's really important to emphasize here is that there are things that you should automate in compliance. There are things that you should not. One that comes to mind is what Charlie brought up about policies, for example. Policies need to be tailored to your business. There needs to be some real thought that goes into that. It doesn't quite make sense to fully automate something like a policy, but evidence collection, something that is manual and redundant, definitely something that you should automate, both in terms of collection and submission. So we have a lot of automation in the Hyperproof platform, but always in the spirit of making sure that when you do get audited, you are truly compliant. So that's a little bit about our compliance operations model.
So a couple of things I'd just like to touch on quick, Marco, if I could. The evidence collection. It's one of the biggest concerns and problems we see outside of year one. You'd think, after year one, everybody understands, what exactly is being collected. But because of the Great Resignation, the COVID issues that we've seen over the last couple of years, there's been a high degree of turnover at a large number of our customers. And people aren't there that were there during the previous audit. People don't know what was collected, why it was collected. So it wastes a lot of your time not having a good insight into what was there and acceptable year one or year two or whatever year you're in. So using a platform similar to Hyperproof, you can see what's there. When a new person comes on, you can assign that person as the control owner in the tool. So they'll get needled with an email saying, hey, it's time for you to upload the quarterly vulnerability scans results. So the tool has a lot of automation that helps streamline the process. We always worry because I used to be on the other side of the table. We always worry about taking away from our customers real work. An audit's not something that most organizations carve out time for each year. So they generally don't have people assigned to it. So they have to take away from something else, revenue generation activities, right, or securing the infrastructure. So having a platform like this will be helpful for most organizations. It has been for our customers. So it's imperative that you think about that, because as people leave, that knowledge leaves, and to have a platform that'll be able to demonstrate what was previously accepted and when they can communicate with your auditors through, it's important. One other thing I wanted to talk about on here, the automated piece. So, it's a great utility, but as an auditor, I do want to make sure, because I know other auditors are on this call, that you still, when you use any tool, you still need to ensure the completeness and the accuracy of the data that is being provided. So if, you've got JIRA, right? You've got to make sure the completeness and the accuracy of the data being pulled out of the JIRA system. You got to make sure the completeness and the accuracy of the data being put into the JIRA system. So the tool is great. It grabs all that stuff, but you still, as an auditor, you got to do your procedures to make sure you gain reasonable comfort over that. So it's an important point that's been brought up by the AICP over the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's a great point, Charlie. And I know the scope of the call is not to go too deep into product, but I will say there's a thoughtfulness around how we execute those types of automations down to something as straightforward as a JIRA integration. Not only are we integrating into JIRA so that you can have a bidirectional data flow with the system that your developers might use, but the way we construct evidence around how you're using JIRA and automate the creation of evidence that shows this is how we're using JIRA to tackle our issues has the appropriate metadata for the auditors to review and verify that that is correct. So we think a couple steps ahead always to what questions are going to be asked and are we automating things in the correct manner. But a great point there, Trevor.
All right. Marco, if I remember correctly, we were going to stop here, right?
Yep. We're going to stop here. We've got some resources for the group, but that's really the presentation that we had for today. If you're interested in learning more about the Bonadio Group or about Hyperproof, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you both so much. I would like to, open the floor if anyone has any other questions they wanted to submit. Please go ahead and get those in now. We did have a question about the presentation recording and how to access it. Again, this will be made available in a follow-up email. There will be a link to the recording, and also this recording will be held on our Bright Talk channel for the foreseeable future. So you will be able to access it anytime, share it with any colleagues. Again, if you have any other questions, please enter them now. I'll give you just a couple minutes.
Yeah, and the other thing I'll say to that is if you think of questions in the next couple of days, feel free to reach out. The link on here is to contact us. My email address is cwood@bonadio.com. Be more than happy to answer any questions you guys have if something pops up over the next couple of days that is of interest to you.
Awesome.
Okay, it looks like we don't have anything else coming in, so we'll go ahead and stop here. Again, thank you all for joining us and for registering, and we look forward to talking to you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.